Soon, Lu Sheng carefully read the 3 techniques. After reading so much information, he began to feel tired and sleepy, so he closed his eyes, put his hand near his mouth, and started yawning. Then, he crossed his arms, stared at the system windows intently, and thought that the advanced technique of stellar refinement technique was called Art of Immortality. Turns out this was just the beginning. He began to imagine the martial will and came to the conclusion that the true key to ascending from level 6 to 7 was by condensing the martial will, merging essence, energy, and spirit into a single entity. Then he had to feed this back into his body, thus achieving an additional improvement in physical constitution. However, ascending from level 7 to level 8 was something deeper and more complicated. He remembered how Zhuang Qi had ascended to level 8 and had been able to grab the light with his hand. To do this, he not only needed martial willpower but also had to break the bridge of the earth with his body, transforming his blood and condensing it into a Dan, turning from mortal to immortal. Martial willpower could be condensed like a spear, like a sword, opening the bridge to the sky, connecting with nature and the cosmos. He began to imagine himself meditating. In this way, martial willpower infused every inch of flesh and bone, making each movement contain a trace of the power of nature. If Lu Sheng managed to master this, then he would be able to kill his enemies with a single hand movement, since the destructive power would far surpass that of level 7. This was the biggest difference between level 7 and level 8. Although Zhuang Qi had managed to ascend to level 8, Lu Sheng knew exactly what he lacked. He turned his head to one side and with a serious look, he thought that Zhuang Qi had forced the improvement of his body, which had left a deficient foundation. In reality, he could not be considered a true level 8 Grandmaster. After thinking this, Lu Sheng put his hand under his chin and began to read carefully the information displayed on the system window. Several minutes later, the expression on his face changed drastically. He began to shout with excitement as he had discovered that immortal cells were the key. The true inheritance of the stellar refinement technique was the introduction of the concept of immortal cells. In order to achieve a true state where, even if the star extinguished, he would not perish, even if all things withered away, he would endure. This meant that only by reaching this level could he ascend to level 8. He began to imagine himself in Zhonghe. In other words, this was the physical strength that Lu Sheng was looking for. The reason he could be more powerful than common masters was because he possessed an immortal golden body at level 7. His body was comparable, and even stronger than that of a level 8 Grand Master like Jiang He. The first thing that was done in the art of stellar immortality was that the practitioner broke their Dan. The immense energy and blood, along with martial willpower, were used to cultivate a cell, and that cell was an immortal cell. At the beginning, when he started practicing the stellar refinement technique to obtain an immortal golden body, he thought that having a body like a star and striking with the force of a star was just an exaggerated metaphor, merely a martial aspiration. For him, it was like when someone compared a level 9 martial saint to the sun and moon in the sky. The real question was, can a martial saint truly shine like the sun and moon? While Lu Sheng had his arms crossed and was reading the content of the system windows around him, he began to smile and thought that this question made the myth reflect in reality, demonstrating immortality in person. If the Dark Illuminator King's scripture reached perfection and detail, then even immortal cells could reach maximum greatness. He began to imagine himself floating in space, while his body was surrounded by golden energy. If all the cells in the body could become immortal, then true union with the universe would be achieved, mastering the stars and attaining eternal immortality. Lu Sheng began to imagine Wang as the supreme being of the universe, and estimated that not even he had reached that level. This was a much grander project than that of the illuminating Dark King. Lu Sheng dropped his arms, started staring at the system windows, and a question came to his mind. In order to achieve this, he didn't know what resources were necessary for irrigation. He closed his eyes and with a smile, he thought that by calculating well, not even a whole star would be enough. At that moment, his body began to emit immense energy and blood. He thought that anyway, this was an invincible technique by just achieving an immortal cell. If he could do this, then his martial body would far surpass that of the common great masters. With 2 cells, he would be unstoppable, and with 3, he would be invincible. He closed his eyes, and as his body was surrounded by an intense aura, he began to bring his hands together, causing his Dan to gradually appear. In the realm of dreams, even if Lu Sheng made a mistake in practice, the impact on reality would be minimal, and for this reason he had no fear. In a matter of seconds, his Dan began to appear. However, this was what sustained all his energy and blood. He extended his hand to the side and it started emitting a blue aura. Then, he opened his eyes and began to stare fixedly at his Dan, questioning if it was really necessary to break it. Without giving it much thought, he decided to give it a try. While his hand was emitting a powerful blue aura, he placed his hand on his chest and gave the order for his dan to break. In a matter of seconds, slowly but surely, his dan began to shatter into pieces, and a powerful energy started pouring out of his body, causing him terrible pain. Due to the pain, he extended his hands to the sides, bent his body, and began screaming in agony. But immediately he calmed down, put his hand back on his chest, and decided to condense his dan. Because of this, he opened his mouth, started bleeding, and felt even more pain. He couldn't help but close his eyes and scream in pain. While he had his hand on his chest and his body was expelling energy, his consciousness, which was made of blue fire, began to manifest. Seeing that Lu Sheng was suffering, his consciousness put its hand on his head and gradually the energy started to stabilize. Thanks to the help of his consciousness, Lu Sheng closed his eyes and began to condense energy in his forehead. In a matter of seconds, he was able to cultivate an immortal cell. An immortal cell was born on Lu Sheng's head. He dropped his arms, clenched his fists tightly, and his forehead started emitting the same energy as the immortal cell. Then, he tightly clenched his fist and his body was surrounded by a powerful orange aura. At that moment, Lu Sheng combined this energy with the golden energy and delivered a strong punch to the ground, shattering it into pieces. Lu Sheng's strike was so powerful that golden thunders appeared throughout the dream space sky and began destroying all the buildings. Several seconds later, he began to sigh and deactivated the technique, causing the golden aura that was around his body to start disappearing. Lu Sheng's strike had destroyed the entire dream space city and created a large crack in the ground. Seeing how powerful this power was, he began to question if this was the strength of an immortal cell. Little by little, he began to stand up. He had only used a small part of the power of the immortal cell, and yet he was able to throw a much stronger punch than any of his previous punches. Lu Sheng stood up, started shaking his fist, stared at it intently, and couldn't help but smile. The strength of a star, the blood and energy, the power, the grip of the star, the fist of the four realms, all had merged into a single punch thanks to the immortal cell. He began to reach out his hand towards the sky and thought that this was the combination of extreme strength and extreme skill. He decided to give a name to this strike. While Lu Sheng's body was surrounded by a golden aura, he tightly clenched his fist, started staring straight ahead, and with a serious look, he decided to call this strike the Fist of Heaven. At that moment, little by little Lu Sheng's eyes began to close. He didn't know why suddenly he felt so tired. He lost control over his body and fell backwards onto the ground. He was completely powerless, having only condensed a single cell. While little by little his eyes were closing, he began to look towards the sky and came to the conclusion that this was also related to his own lack of energy and blood. He needed to obtain more resources. In the dream space sky, 3 giant monsters appeared who with a murderous gaze began to stare at Lu Sheng. They were eager to fight him. Fortunately, he didn't have to worry about obtaining more resources, as he was soon going to the military district of the east. The battlefield on the front line was full of exotic beasts, and danger also meant wealth, just what he needed to fill the insatiable void of the immortal cell. With his last bit of strength, he reached out towards the sky. Seeing how powerful an immortal cell was, he began to question if he would be able to fight against a martial saint at level 7 with 10 immortal cells. He began to stare up at the sky and thought that if 10 cells were not enough, then he was going to cultivate 100 or even 1,000 if necessary. He supposed that with 1,000 cells, he would be able to crush the extreme martial saint with just one move. For today, he had had enough, so he decided to take it step by step. He closed his eyes and left the dream space, waking up in his room. He sat on the bed, turned his head towards the clock, and upon seeing the time, he put his hand on his head. This dream had turned out to be very satisfying, as he had slept for about 12 hours. With a serious look, Lu Sheng activated his senses, causing his body to emit a blue aura. Thanks to this, he saw that his father was happily playing chess with the general, his sister, who had headphones on, had her eyes closed and was dancing in the yard, and his mother was cooking. He came to the conclusion that Jidao's henchmen were not going to come. He put his hand on his knee, turned his head to one side, started enjoying the views through the window and thought that after all, Jidao's martial saint would not risk their reputation by fighting a 19-year-old young man to death for 2 relatives. To him they were scum who ultimately had to maintain some dignity. Lu Sheng got off the bed, put on his flip-flops, and thought that the woman named Lion Su was not going to be as calm as the extreme martial saint. He put on his shirt, left his room, and started going down the stairs. He still needed to eliminate the danger in its cradle, He had to find an opportunity to crush Lion Su. Lu Sheng went down to the kitchen, grabbed a bun that his mother had prepared and told her that he was leaving. While she was holding a tray, she slightly turned her head towards him and thought that he was hopeless since once again he was leaving without eating properly. He took the bun, turned his back on his mother, and began to move away from her. Along the way, he passed by the living room and something caught his attention, so he quickly turned his head to one side and saw that the television was on. Lingsu went to the television for an interview. Lu Sheng took a bite of the bun, started watching the television and couldn't help but smile since he hadn't seen her in a while, and he happened to have something to talk to her about. This is the end of the video. If you guys want to see the next part, then don't forget to subscribe and like the video.